Welcome to Researching the U.S. Civil War Records. Before we get into the research, it's important to understand a few facts about the United States Civil War. First of all, the war was fought between the northern and southern states between 1861 and 1865. Abraham Lincoln was President of the United States during the Civil War. You might think that these are pretty simple facts to know, but you'd be surprised how many people are really not aware of the time period or the events that occurred during the United States Civil War. The main issues were slavery and the centralized government power that divided the nation between the North and the South. In the North, there were 2,128,948 men who served out of a total population of approximately 22 million. In the South, there were approximately 9 million people in the total population, and of those, 1,082,119 men served in the Confederate Army. There were approximately 620,000 men who died and 476,000 were wounded. 400,000 were captured or missing. It is hard to understand the impact that this had on the United States and the entire population. It is very, very likely that almost every family had some impact from the American Civil War, either from a loss of a family member or someone or another near relative. For every 3 soldiers that were killed in battle, 5 more died of disease. About 25% of all the soldiers who left for service never returned home. And a completely accurate count of the casualties will likely never be made available. It's important to compare the U.S. Civil War with some of the other wars that have been fought by the United States. If we look back at the most recent war, the Gulf War, the number of casualties was only 258. That's compared to 620,000 people who died in the U.S. Civil War. Even World War II doesn't come close to the number of casualties of the U.S. Civil War with 405,399 deaths. Abraham Lincoln said, "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." It is difficult to understand the feelings and depth of emotions that were brought to the surface by the U.S. Civil War. Families were divided. Husbands were separated from their sons, and sons were separated from their brothers. Before you start researching your ancestors, I suggest that you read some history. With the Civil War, there are some basic books that cover the depth of the war itself. First, I'd suggest Bruce Caton's The Centennial History of the Civil War in 3 volumes. This is probably one of the best written history books I have ever read. The Coming Fury, The Terrible Swift Sword, and Never Call Retreat are the titles of the 3 volumes of this series. Allan Nevins wrote The Ordeal of the Union back in 1947 in 8 volumes, and Allan Nevins and the Rogers D. Spotswood collection, The War for the Union, was published in 1959. It's very important to understand that genealogy is historical research, and it's very hard to do historical research without knowing a lot about history. This seems to be one of the greatest obstacles facing genealogists that I run into on an almost daily basis, that they seldom understand or appreciate the historical context of their ancestors' lives. And for that reason, they are severely limited in finding historical records about their families. Fortunately, there are millions of records from the time of the Civil War. Some of these records include the United States Civil War Soldiers Index from 1861 to 65, the Confederate and Union compiled military service records, enlistment records, Confederate and Union pension records, and the United States Federal Census records beginning in 1850 and 1860, where all family members were listed. If you begin your search for records about the possible soldier in the Civil War, the question immediately arises of where do you start? I suggest that searching the usual genealogical sources is helpful. You need to know some basic information about the birth, marriage, and death of the individual ancestor to find them among the millions of soldiers in the Civil War lists. In this regard, places are extremely important. You need to know the likely place where your soldier enlisted. Many soldiers with the same name may have enlisted in different units in different states and different areas, and it's only through doing extensive research that you're sometimes able to separate out these individuals. You do this by looking for personal records, if any, about your soldier. These include U.S. Census records, Bible records, employment records, land and property records, school records, diaries and letters, photographs, probate records, and grave markers. With some of this information, you may be able to locate and differentiate your soldier from those who fought in the war with the same name. Some of the major online repositories for Civil War records that are very valuable are FamilySearch.org with millions of records, the National Park Service Soldiers and Sailors Database on the Civil War has 6.3 million records, and Fold3.com, a subscription website owned by Ancestry.com, has over 45 million records. Ancestry.com is also a subscription site, includes the Military Headstone Archive from 1861 to 65. For an example, the National Park Service Soldiers and Sailors System is available for free online. You can search the database and giving the name and state and other information that you know, including the battle unit. However, if you are searching the database, you may need some of the additional information I already mentioned because of the duplicates. For example, my ancestor, John Morgan, who fought in the U.S. Civil War, there are 40 different entries for John Morgan's with different battle units, so it may be hard to differentiate these individuals and determine which one was your ancestor and which one was the actual unit in which he served. So you may need to do more research in depth, particularly historical research, to match the names to the units and to research both, and check the unit's history for the time frame of the enlistment. It's interesting that there are local histories and collected histories of nearly every unit in the Civil War. Many of these mention the names of the individuals who were involved in those units. So it's kind of a chicken and an egg problem. You have to determine the unit, before you can find your soldier, and you may need to know your soldier's history before you can find and identify which unit he enlisted in. Look for more information about the soldiers in other databases, and be sure and check the military cemetery records. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs National Cemetery Administration has the nationwide gravesite locator online, where you can search for grave sites for your ancestors. There are hundreds of other websites with Civil War information. The major repositories with limited records online include the U.S. National Archives, the Library of Congress, and the Smithsonian Institution. It's not that these agencies don't have a lot of records, they simply have not and do not provide digital copies of those records online in any quantity. Most of the records from these repositories are actually appearing in Ancestry.com, Fold3.com, and on FamilySearch.org. There are lots of additional online collections of Civil War records. Here's a sample. The American Civil War Collection from Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville, the U.S. Army Center of Military History, the Grand Valley State University Civil War and Slavery Collection, Penn State University Civil War Collection, the University of Iowa's Civil War Diaries and Letters, Cornell University's Library Making of America, the Virginia Tech Civil War Images, the Valley of the Shadow from the University of Virginia Library, and the Gilmer Civil War Maps collection. You probably got the idea that large public and university libraries may have Civil War records. For example, I work at the Brigham Young University Harold B. Lee Library in Provo, Utah, which has 4,300 items pertaining to the U.S. Civil War listed in its catalog. The online resources from the BYU Library also include the American Civil War Research Database, the American Civil War Letters and Diaries Database, the Civil War Archive, and the CivilWar.com website, which is also available outside the university. With university collections online, you may need to come to the library and use the online resources after receiving a password to gain entry to the university collections. It is not unusual for university libraries to be accessible primarily only by registered students and faculty, and those who wish to obtain access by going to the university itself. However, there are a number of records available online, including the New York State Archives Civil War Soldier Database. You might want to check to see the availability of these records in your own community, library, or through your local universities or colleges. Remember also to look in local museum and historical societies. Many of these records may not be online, but may be available in or near the location where your soldier enlisted or lived, where his family lived during the war. It's not unusual for local historical societies to have gathered Civil War records about their local units. Let's look at some of the types of records to search. First is the United States Civil War Soldiers Index. This particular index is viewable on Fold3.com, which is available for free view at the Family Search Centers throughout the world. If you go to FamilySearch.org and get help, you can find the Family History Center closest to you for getting access to this program. Also, it is a subscription program, so you could subscribe. There are over 34 million Civil War service records on Fold3.com. The Fold3 also has over 4 million Civil War widows' pension records, almost 3 million of the Civil War pensions index, and over 2 million Confederate citizens' files. There are hundreds of thousands of other records in other categories and collections on Fold3.com pertaining to the U.S. Civil War. The more you know about the U.S. Civil War, the more likely you are to find your soldier ancestor. Thank you for watching today.